Hey everyone, welcome back to Conviction Bet. Hope you're doing well. It's been a jumpy stretch out there. The S&P 500 finished last week down about 1.5%, snapping a 3-week winning streak. Chip stocks took another beating on Monday before bouncing back on Tuesday, and long bond yields are still elevated after last week's surge, even with the 10-year easing off in the last couple of sessions. NVIDIA reports Wednesday after the bell. The July inflation read lands the same morning. Canada has answered Washington's tariffs with about $20 billion of its own, and nobody wants to commit to a view until Kevin Warsh has given his first Jackson Hole keynote at the end of the week. Which brings me to the most honest number of the week, and it isn't any of those. The University of Michigan's preliminary consumer sentiment reading for August came in at 51, and the final revision lands Friday, the same morning Warsh speaks. The S&P 500 is sitting just under 7,700. Same country, same month, two completely different answers to the question of how things are going. But here's what actually matters. In May, the Federal Reserve published its annual survey of American household finances. 63% of adults said they would cover a $400 emergency with cash. 70% said they could cover an expense of at least $500 using only their savings. 55% said they had a rainy day fund holding 3 months of expenses. And 50% said they could not put their hands on $2,000 right now. Same survey. Two measures that refuse to line up. And the Fed flags the discrepancy themselves. 3 months of expenses, they note, would run to more than $2,000 for many families. The headline version of this data is a story about how much Americans have saved. The real story is that changing how you ask about a dollar changes what people tell you they can do with it. And the thing doing the changing is not the balance, it's the name on it. I'm JL Maurer, and this is Conviction Bet. We believe the stories that move your portfolio are usually quieter than the ones that move the tape. Here's where we're going. I'm going to argue that the most underrated piece of financial infrastructure you own is not an account type or a fund or a tax wrapper. It's a label, a word you wrote on a pile of money. I'll show you the 117-year-old bank product that had Americans lining up to lock their own money away where they couldn't reach it, and the 2026 data showing a 14 percentage point gap between what one set of funds returned and what the people inside them actually earned, and why I think purpose may explain part of that gap alongside the volatility. I'll give you the arithmetic that turns financial independence from a wall into a ladder, and the surprisingly small number that gets one recurring expense to the classic 25 times mark. And then I'm going to make a claim that is going to sound like an excuse. The savings goal you quietly abandoned this year probably did more for you than you think. Let's start with the survey, because the numbers are stranger than they look. The Fed's report is called the Survey of Household Economics and Decision Making. It's been running since 2013, it's fielded every October, and the 2025 edition landed this past May. The famous question is the $400 one. Could you cover an unexpected $400 expense with cash or its equivalent? 63% said yes, which is exactly where that number has sat for 4 straight years. But the Fed asks a second question, and it's the one nobody quotes. It asks what the largest emergency expense is that you could handle right now using only savings. 70% of adults said at least $500. 70% could, 63% would. The Fed flags that gap themselves in the report in plain language. Some people choose to pay another way, even when they have the cash available to them. Now hold that thought and look at the 3-month question. 55% of American adults say they have savings set aside to cover 3 months of expenses if they lost their income. For most families, 3 months of expenses is a great deal more than $2,000. And yet only 50% of adults said they could cover an expense of $2,000 or more using savings right now. The Fed noticed the contradiction. There's a footnote 39, if you want to go find it, where they try to explain it, and I want to be careful here, because they hedge it, and I'm going to hedge it exactly the same way. They say one possible explanation is the phrase right now. There may be assets, they write, such as retirement funds, that people would consider tapping if they went 3 months without a job, but would not consider tapping right now for an emergency. Read that again. For at least some of these households, the money exists sitting in an account they do not count as available right now. Not because they can't reach it, because reaching it would require the emergency to be the right kind of emergency. If that's what's happening, it isn't a savings problem. It's a filing problem, and it has a price tag. In that same report, 15% of all adults said that if a $400 bill landed tomorrow, they'd put it on a credit card and carry the balance. Now, some of those people genuinely have nothing. 12% of adults said they could not pay a $400 expense by any means at all, and I don't want to be glib about that for them. This is arithmetic, not psychology, and no amount of relabeling fixes it. But look at how the 3-month number splits, because the pattern is not what you'd guess. Among households earning $100,000 or more, 75% have the 3-month fund. Among households under $25,000, 21% do. That's income, doing what income does. Then there's this. 86% of adults who said they always have money left over at the end of the month have 3 months of expenses saved against 13% of those who never do. 86 versus 13. That is a wider spread than anything in the income rows. It's a descriptive table, not a controlled study, so I'll put it carefully. The variable I would look at first is not what you earn. It's whether there's a systematic gap between what comes in and what goes out, and whether anything is standing at the end of that gap to catch what falls through. So here's the first thing this means for you as an investor. If you have ever stared at a perfectly adequate balance and concluded that you couldn't afford something you actually needed, you weren't being disciplined. You were consulting the wrong account. And that mistake has a price. It can mean carrying expensive credit card debt while preserving cash somewhere else. Now, let me tell you about the best bad financial product in American history. In 1909, a man named Merkel Landis, the treasurer of the Carlyle Trust Company in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, launched something he called a Christmas Savings Fund. The pitch was simple. You deposit a fixed amount every week for a year. In early December, the bank hands it back and you go do your Christmas shopping. 350 customers signed up. The average one put in about $28, which is somewhere around $1,000 in today's money. Now look at that product the way a rational person is supposed to look at products. It locked your money up until December. If you wanted it early, you generally paid a fee, and in many versions, you forfeited whatever interest you had earned. The rates varied. Some clubs paid roughly what an ordinary savings account paid, plenty paid less, and some paid nothing at all. So set the yield aside, because it is the wrong thing to be looking at. What every version of this product had in common was that it was strictly worse on the dimension people claim to care about most. You could not get at your own money. Americans loved it. Banks and credit unions across the country copied it and then competed for the business, handing out branded tokens and premiums to get people to sign up. It got more popular during the Great Depression, not less. It ran through most of the 20th century. You can still open one today at a community bank or a credit union. So why would anyone knowingly take the worst account? Because they were not buying yield. They were buying a December they didn't have to dread. That's the whole trade, and it's the metaphor I want you to hold for the rest of this episode. A Christmas club is a machine for converting a financial asset into a specific, dated, named future, and people paid for that conversion in liquidity and often in yield too, happily for a century. Richard Thaler gave this behavior a name. He introduced the term mental accounting in a paper in Marketing Science in 1985 and summarized 2 decades of work on it in a 1999 review called Mental Accounting Matters. He won the Nobel in Economics in 2017, in significant part for this line of research. The core observation is that money is supposed to be fungible. A dollar is a dollar, regardless of where it came from or what you intend to do with it, and that human beings comprehensively refuse to behave that way. We sort money into categories, and then we treat the categories as though they were separate currencies with separate exchange rates. Thaler and Hirsch Sheffrin pushed it further in 1988 in a paper in Economic Inquiry. They propose that households split their wealth into three mental accounts: current income, current assets, and future income, and that the willingness to spend falls off a cliff as you move down that list. Money in this month's paycheck feels spendable. Money in a brokerage account feels considerably less spendable. Money that hasn't arrived yet feels almost untouchable. Same household, same balance sheet, three completely different spending rules applied automatically without anyone deciding to apply them. And this is not a laboratory curiosity with undergraduates answering hypothetical questions. The cleanest field evidence I know of comes from Justine Hastings and Jesse Shapiro in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 2013. They had panel data on real purchases, over 10.5 million gasoline transactions from 61,494 households. When gas prices rose, families downgraded from premium to regular, which sounds obvious until you look at the size of the effect. The downgrade was far larger than the hit to their real income could possibly justify. A price rise at the pump barely dents a household budget in aggregate, and yet the behavior changed as though it had. Across specification after specification, the authors rejected the idea that these families treated gas money as interchangeable with the rest of their money. They had a gas budget. It had walls. The walls were real enough to change what came out of the pump. So here's the second thing this means for you. You are not deciding whether to do mental accounting. That decision was never on the table. The wiring is standard issue. It turns up in a nationally representative Fed survey and in 10.5 million transactions at the pump. The only decision you actually get is whether you're doing it on purpose or by accident. And accidental mental accounting is the version that leaves you paying 19% on a bill you could have covered from a savings account you'd quietly ring fence for something else. So here's where it gets interesting, because we can now put a number on what the label is worth. In June, Vanguard published the 25th edition of How America Saves, which tracks the retirement behavior of nearly 5 million American workers. Over the life of that report series, participation among eligible employees has gone from 65% to a record 86%. 61% of plans now use automatic enrollments. The average total savings rate employee contributions plus the employer match hit an all-time high of 12.1%. The average account balance finished 2025 at $167,970. Though hold that one loosely, the median was $44,115. That average is being hauled upward by a small number of very large accounts. But the number I keep going back to is this one. Across a year that included real volatility, 5% of participants traded. 95 out of every 100 people watched the market do whatever it did and touched nothing. And it gets more specific than that. Vanguard finds that participants who hold nothing but a target date fund trade 4 to 5 times less often than everybody else in the plan. A target date fund pairs an unusually clear label a year with automatic diversification, automatic rebalancing, and a glide path that shifts without anyone touching it. I can't separate which of those is doing the work, but notice that the label is the part the investor actually sees. Now hold all of that next to what happens in accounts where the money has no job. Morningstar publishes an annual study called Mind the Gap, which measures the distance between what a fund returned and what the average dollar invested in that fund actually earned. The gap reflects the timing and the size of investor cash flows when money goes in, when it comes out, and how much. The 2026 edition came out in August. Across all U.S. funds and ETFs over the 10 years through the end of 2025, the average dollar earned 8.7% a year against an aggregate fund return of 9.9%, a gap of 1.2 percentage points a year, or roughly 12% of the total return, evaporated on timing alone. In U.S. stock funds specifically, though, investors did beautifully. 12.8% for the average dollar against 13.3% for the funds. Essentially, the entire return captured. And then there are crypto ETFs. From January 2024, when the first batch listed, through the end of June this year, Morningstar estimates the average dollar invested in those ETFs lost about 5.8% a year. The ETFs themselves returned 8.5% a year over the same stretch. That is a gap of more than 14 percentage points. The vehicle made money. The people inside the vehicle lost money. Riley, which is a difficult sentence to say out loud. Now, I want to be precise about what I'm claiming and what I'm not, because this is exactly where it would be easy to overreach. Morningstar's own explanation is volatility, and they have the gradient to back it. Across the study, the gap was 0.4 of a percentage point in the least volatile funds and more than 2 points in the most volatile. The size of the moves sparks the urge to trade, and mistimed transactions follow. That's their read. It's measured rather than asserted, and it's a strong one. They've also noted in an earlier edition that funds sitting inside 401k plans and target date funds show narrower gaps than ETFs, which don't get that plumbing. My hypothesis, and I'll flag it as a hypothesis because these are two different periods, two different asset classes, two different sets of investors, and nobody has run the controlled experiments, is that some of what looks like a volatility effect is a purpose effect. The 401k dollar has a name on it. The name is retirement. It comes with a date, a horizon, an automatic contribution, and a default fund. The crypto ETF dollar has no name. Its name is upside. And a dollar whose name is upside has no reason to stay anywhere in particular. You can watch the same mechanism run in the other direction deliberately. In 2004, in the Journal of Political Economy, Thaler and Shlomo Benartzi published the results of a program called Save More Tomorrow. Employees pre-committed to raising their retirement contribution rate out of future pay raises, so the increase never arrived as a cut to take-home pay. 78% of the workers who were offered it signed up. Their average savings rate went from 3.5% to 13.6% over 40 months. 80% of them were still in it after the fourth raise. Nobody in that study got a raise they wouldn't otherwise have had. What they got was a pre-commitment tied to future income with automation, doing the follow-through. Hold on to that pattern because it's the one this whole episode keeps landing on. The label is the part you can see, and on its own, it may not carry much. So here's the third thing this means for you. These data sets cannot tell you how much of that gap belongs to labeling and how much to volatility, automation, horizon, or simply who buys which product. But whatever share does belong to the label, it is the cheapest input on that list by a distance. You set it once in a calm moment before the volatility arrives, and it costs nothing. Let's bring this back to the side of the ledger nobody talks about. Everything so far has been about a label helping you save or helping you sit still. That's the easy half. The harder and more interesting claim is that a label is what gives you permission to spend. Go back to the Fed's numbers one more time. 70% could, 63% would. That aggregate gap suggests some people with savings available still choose another way to pay, which is exactly how the Fed reads it. Think about what an earmarked account actually does for that person. Suppose you decide you need dental work, call it $4,000, and you start putting money aside for it under that name on a schedule. Then the day arrives, your cash flow happens to be fine, you pay for it out of income, and you never touch the fund at all. Did the account fail? The account did the entire job. From the week you opened it, you stopped being a person who might not be able to afford dental work and became a person who could and knew it. The certainty was the product. The money was just how you bought the certainty. There's a related version of this that I think is the single most useful mechanic in the whole idea, and it works on discretionary spending rather than necessities. Take something you want, can technically already afford, and have been circling for months without buying the sort of purchase where the sticker price isn't the obstacle, the flinch is. Instead of buying it or not buying it, you open an account with its name on it and fund it in installments until it's full. Two things happen, and both of them are good. The first is that you pay the financial cost slowly, in pieces small enough that no single one of them feels like a decision. The second is better. By the time the money is there, the only question left is whether you still want the thing. And you now have months of evidence on that question rather than an afternoon of it. If you still want it, you buy it without flinching because it's already paid for. If you don't, the money moves somewhere else and you've been spared a purchase you'd have resented. Either outcome is a win, which is a rare property in personal finance. And once you see the mechanism this way, you can run it at a much smaller scale than the retirement planning industry does, and it gets genuinely surprising. Bill Bengen published the 4% rule in the Journal of Financial Planning in October of 1994. He tested 30-year retirements against U.S. market history back to 1926 and found that 4.15% was the highest starting withdrawal rate that never failed. He didn't call it the 4% rule. Incidentally, that name came later from everybody else. The Trinity study came along in 1998 and made it famous. And somewhere along the way, it got flipped into the rule of 25. Take what you spend in a year, multiply by 25, and that's your number. We've covered the limits of that rule at length in an earlier episode, so I'll say only this carefully. It was built for a 30-year drawdown, not for perpetuity, and stretching it into a forever calculation is a stretch. I'm naming it as one rather than pretending otherwise. But run the arithmetic anyway, because the output is clarifying in a way the seven-figure version never is. There's an older ASPCA figure that puts basic recurring care for a cat at about $634 a year. Food, litter, the annual checkup, the predictable stuff, divide by 4%. $15,850. That is 25 times a year's routine cat. Not a cat forever. Bengen's finding was about surviving 30 years, and I am not going to quietly upgrade that into perpetuity. 25 times the annual bill on the classic framework, except that the word routine is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence, and this is where the exercise earns its keep. Synchrony ran a study last year on the lifetime cost of pet care. Their low end for a cat was $20,073 across a 15-year life. Call it $1,338 a year. Once the surprises are in there, their high end was $47,106. Cat owners, asked to guess, said somewhere under $6,000. Nearly 8 in 10 pet owners underestimated what they were signing up for. Run the honest annual number through the same arithmetic, and it roughly doubles, $33,450. That gap, $16,000 versus $33,500, is the whole argument for naming the account. The label is what made you run the second calculation. Or take a smaller one. A Spotify individual subscription went to $12.99 a month in the US this past February. That's $155.88 a year. Divide by 4%, $3,897. Under $4,000 covers 25 years of Spotify at today's price. Not the rest of your life. But 25 years is not nothing, and it is a far smaller number than you were expecting. Why does that arithmetic matter? Because financial independence, stated as a single number, is a wall. It's a 7-figure abstraction that sits at the end of the road being unreachable, and the honest emotional response to a wall is to stop looking at it. Stated as a list of specific expenses you have already reached the 25 times mark on, it becomes a ladder, and most people are a rung or two up it without ever having noticed they were climbing. And that is the less romantic half of why this works. A named account forces arithmetic you have been actively avoiding. And now the uncomfortable part, and I want to state it carefully, because it sounds like a get-out-of-jail card. Most people who start doing this end up with accounts they stop funding, a trip they no longer want, a plan that made sense 2 years ago and doesn't now, a goal that got quietly outranked by a different goal. And the standard reading is that this is a failure of discipline, that you're the sort of person who starts. I don't think that's the only reading. And here's the alternative. A labeled account is not a promise. It's a snapshot of what you believed your money was for on the day you opened it. Sometimes you stop funding one because your priorities moved and the ledger noticed. Sometimes the income disappeared, or you simply lost interest. I'm not going to pretend every abandoned goal is secretly a success. But in the first case, the account did real work. It existed long enough for you to find out you didn't want the thing, which is information you did not previously have, and you bought it for the price of some idle cash and a little embarrassment. So here's the fourth thing this means for you. Stop reading an abandoned savings goal as evidence that you're bad at this. Read the other list instead. The accounts you have kept funding year after year without needing to be reminded, that is a rough map of what your money is actually for. It's a revealed preference portfolio, and unlike the one in your brokerage statement, nobody sold it to you. And I know what the bear case is. The bear case says all of this is a bias and that I have spent half an hour dressing up a documented cognitive error as a strategy. Money is fungible. Thaler's entire point in 1999 was that mental accounting violates fungibility and that violations of fungibility cost people money. Michael Kitces has made the sharpest version of this argument in the retirement context. Bucket strategies, the professional grade version of exactly what I've been describing, are, in his framing, an asset allocation mirage. Run the rebalancing math on a 3-bucket portfolio and on a single total return portfolio at the same overall stock bond mix, and you get essentially identical outcomes. Worse than identical, sometimes. Rigid bucketing produces cash drag, and it can quietly ratchet a portfolio more conservative than the retiree ever intended because the mechanics of refilling the short bucket end up spending the stocks first. And there's harder evidence behind him. Javier Estrada at IESE Business School in Barcelona tested bucket approaches against simple static allocations across 21 countries over the 115 years from 1900 to 2014. The bucket strategies he tested underperformed the static strategies he tested them against on all 4 measures he used. There's even a shot available at the underlying science. Last September, Mengfei Li and Gilad Feldman published a registered replication in Royal Society Open Science, testing 17 of the classic mental accounting problems from Thaler's 1999 review on a U.S. sample of about 1,000 people. 11 replicated, 3 came back mixed, 3 found no support at all. And Save More Tomorrow, for all its fame, was a field study at a handful of employers, not a randomized trial. The U.S. Department of Labor's own evidence review rates the strength of its causal claim as low. That is a legitimate concern, and I want to concede it cleanly. Kitces is right that rigid bucketing can distort an otherwise sensible allocation. Estrada's results show that the specific strategies he tested underperformed the static portfolios he tested them against. And the behavioral evidence isn't spotless either. Some of the classic mental accounting results replicate better than others, and Save More Tomorrow doesn't give us the causal certainty a randomized trial would. But notice that there are 2 different objections in there, and they are aimed at 2 different targets. Kitces and Estrada are asking whether buckets improve the mathematics of a portfolio. They don't. I am not claiming they do. The replication work and the Save More Tomorrow caveat ask something else entirely. How confident can we be that the labeling itself is what changes the behavior? And the honest answer is less confident than the strongest version of this argument would like. So the claim has to be narrower than the one I'd enjoy making. Don't manage your investments as separate universes because you've given them separate names. Manage the money as one portfolio. But if naming the pieces of it helps you save or stay invested or spend on purpose, then use the label as an interface, not as an allocation. Which is more or less where Kitces lands himself, and it's why his actual conclusion is not the one people quote at him. His proposal is that you manage the portfolio on a total return basis, in one pot, rebalance properly, and then report it to the client in buckets. Label the statement, not the plumbing. Take the allocation of the single portfolio and the behavior of the segregated one. That isn't a compromise. That's the correct answer. And it's this entire episode compressed into one sentence. And there's a useful policy case study sitting right there on the other half of it. What happens when you build the label and skip the plumbing? In December of 2022, Congress passed the Secure 2.0 Act. Section 127 created something called a pension-linked emergency savings account. It is quite literally a legislated mental account, a small Roth sidecar bolted onto your retirement plan, capped at $2,500 with the first 4 withdrawals in a year free of charge. And if your employer matches your regular contributions, they are required by law to match what you put into the sidecar at the same rate that match landing in your main retirement accounts. Matched money attached to a labeled emergency fund, available since the 2024 plan year. Adoption has been close to non-existent. Meanwhile, in that same Vanguard report, 6% of participants took a hardship withdrawal from their retirement account in 2025, up from 5% the year before, and the highest the report has ever recorded. Now, those two facts do not prove that one caused the other. Near zero adoption mostly tells you that employers haven't taken the product up. It doesn't tell you what workers would do if they were offered one. What it does tell you is that the gap the sidecar was built to close is not closing. And it fits the pattern this episode keeps running into. The label by itself may not be enough. Participation climbed from 65% to 86% alongside the spread of automatic enrollment and better plan design, the label wired into payroll with a default standing behind it. Which brings us back to Carlisle, Pennsylvania in 1909. 350 people, $28 apiece, in a savings plan built around a date. Weekly deposits, reduced access, Christmas written into the structure of the thing. Whatever the rate is not what they were buying. They were buying the knowledge every single week from January onward that December was already handled. You are probably running some version of that account right now. The only real question is whether you chose the names or inherited them from whatever you happen to be worried about at the time. Pause. Your balance tells you what you have. The label shapes what you'll actually use. And you're the one who wrote it. Anyway, that's this week. If you're enjoying Conviction Bet, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon, whatever you use. Leave a review if you have 30 seconds. It genuinely helps new listeners find the show. Until next time, stay patient, stay skeptical, and keep your eye on the quiet stuff. I'm J.L. Maurer. This has been Conviction Bet.